This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Sheela Hobden, and I am an executive coach and research practitioner. And in this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to fellow coaches and researchers who share my passion for the transformative potential of research in coaching. Through curious conversations and practical insights, this series aims to inspire coaches to embrace evidence-based practices and enrich their professional journey. Well, hello, I'm Sheela Hobden, a coach, supervisor, mentor coach, and most importantly in this context for today, a practitioner, a researcher. And by that I mean I'm not an academic, I have a coaching practice and I also undertake research. I'm delighted to be hosting this podcast series on behalf of the Association of Coaching on the topic of research in coaching. And I'm very happy to welcome today's guest, Dr. Marie Stopforth. Marie has a background in sports and exercise psychology. She's a coaching psychologist, coach. She has a doctorate in sports psychology. The biggest thing that I think will be interesting to us today is the contribution that she made to the British Psychological Society's coaching psychologist chartership, which of course will have taken an incredible amount of research. Marie is also very passionate about bringing together groups of coaches to learn, share and grow. So welcome, Marie, and please add what I may have missed.
No, thanks, Sheila. Lovely to be here. No, I don't think you've missed anything.
Wonderful. So the idea of this series is to inspire more coaches to pay attention to research, to get curious, maybe become involved, maybe lead some research, use it all to cultivate your practice. So Marie, I'll begin with what made you say yes when I offered you the chance to become a guest?
Well, just what you said, really. I feel passionately about coaches getting involved in research if they want to, if they're interested in that. So whether that be doing research, I'm a supervisor as well. So I speak to lots of coaches who really want to get involved in doing research, but who are no longer part of the university and so feel that that may be not an option for them because they don't know how to do it without the support of a university behind them. So yeah, I'm passionate about supporting people who want to get involved in doing research or continue research that they may have done on an undergraduate or master's degree. But also I'm passionate about helping coaches to be good consumers of research so that their coaching can be evidence-based. And that can be tricky if you haven't got a background in research. You know, if you're faced with a research paper, being able to pick through that and understand what it's telling us, what it's not telling us, being critical of that. So it can be difficult to be a consumer of research. So anything that I can do to support people in both of those or either of those endeavours, I'm absolutely up for.
Amazing. Both of those things sound really exciting. Which one should we speak about first? What do you say to people when they come to supervision saying, oh, but I'm not in university anymore?
It's a tricky one. I was asked once by somebody, am I even allowed to do research now I'm not part of a university? And that question really shocked me because the initial response is, of course you're allowed, you know, but there are some practical implications. There are things that can get in your way. And so those things are things like having an ethical review of your proposed research to make sure that you're collecting that in an ethical way, having full access to research papers that you might need to read to support ground the work that you're doing, having access to software such as data analysis software or qualitative analysis software. So yeah, the answer is yes, of course we can do research. You don't have to be part of a university to do that, but there are some practical things that might get in the way. And so how do we solve that problem? I think there are ways around some of this stuff. And that's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about communities of coaches coming together and supporting each other. So there are ways that you can have somebody review your work from an ethical perspective and give you feedback on that. And there are ways you can access some of the other things that I've talked about. So there are ways of doing it independently. But I think the other thing to mention, which I think is really important, is that universities are full of academics who often feel or have pressure put on them by the university to do research. So some exist within this sort of publish or perish environment within a university. So they're expected to be doing research. But often, and I spent many years as an academic myself, they're often not given the resource, the time really to do that. And so I can guarantee to people that if you're interested in doing research and you've got a certain amount of knowledge of that already, maybe you've done an undergraduate degree, master's degree, you're passionate about this, you have some good ideas, you have a good sense of what would be useful for coaching psychology to know, or coaching, and importantly, you have access to participants, then an academic will bite your hand off if you go to them and say, I'm really interested in doing some research. Would you be interested in supporting it, collaborating with me? So the idea that somebody who is knowledgeable and able could come in and do a lot of that work for them and they get their name on a paper, that's attractive to a lot of academics. So there's real opportunities to hook up with academics within universities if that feels like the easiest and best way of doing it.
I think it's really important for people to hear that message. And I know from my own experience, I'm running my project independently, and I'm not saying it's been easy, but it has been through the network of people that I've been able to do the ethical review and access papers. But the bit about academics wanting coach practitioners to come forward, I think that's really exciting for people. So brilliant.
They don't have the time to do that work. And so, of course, they want that support from others who are able. And the participant piece is really important as well, because often what you'll see in studies that have been done through universities is that they are using a student population as their participants because that's all they have access to. So if you're an independent coach or a coach working with organizations or adult human beings, then you have a whole pool of participants that an academic working in the university might not have access to. So that's precious.
Yes, yeah, it really is. And I found that with my own work, but also the fact that being quite active in the professional bodies like the Association for Coaching, you can get access to people like that. And usually they did for me, happy to promote it to the members. So you've got a further access point there. And from a personal and professional perspective, when you do actually engage in research, your network suddenly multiplies. I think I've got people in my work from about 30 different countries, and the learning that you get from that really is incredible. And so then if I could come to your other point about how consuming research, that was your other interest area. What is good to say about that?
I think it's important for us as coaches to be evidence-based, but there's a but. But I think we need to realise that evidence is on a continuum from the bloke down the pub told me, something that maybe is a randomised controlled trial in a peer-reviewed, top-notch academic journal. It's all evidence.
And Marie, for the listeners, what do we mean by a randomised controlled trial? Because I think it could be a bit jargon. I'm wondering if it's helpful to be clear on that, just as a first step, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's where within your research, you're trying to control as much of the other things that might be impacting on what we're seeing happening as possible. I'll give an example in a minute to bring this to life a bit, I think, where people may have been assigned to either a sort of, I'm going to call it for now a treatment group, I'll explain what that is in a minute, and a control group. So what does that mean? That means that if we wanted to look at something, let's give it a coaching perspective, if we wanted to look at the impact of using a particular tool in coaching on maybe somebody's motivation to go off and complete the actions that they've come up with in the coaching. So we've got some sort of tool that we want to test and see whether they are more likely to be motivated when they use that tool rather than those people who didn't use that tool. So there are so many things that we need to think about. And it's really difficult to do something like a randomized control trial in coaching. But first of all, you would have to have people that use the tool and people that don't use the tool. So that's your treatment group, the people that use the tool, and your control group, the people that don't use the tool. And what you might have to do is get them to do something else. But anyway, and then you're trying to control for anything else that might be impacting on motivation that we might not have thought of.
I think that makes sense. And I think in my own research, I'm looking at the impact of workplace coaching on resilience and well-being. And I've got a control group of people who are not receiving any coaching. And then I've got a group where they're receiving coaching. But I'm also aware that there are workplace well-being programs out there. So I'm asking the question, are you participating in any of those programs? Because that could be influencing the outcomes of the coaching as well. So if I've understood that, I think that's where we're headed.
It's quite a big topic. To do a randomized controlled trial study well is quite difficult, and usually done in laboratory settings, because it's really difficult in sort of real life settings because there's so many other things that might be influencing. But the other, of course, important piece of it is the word randomized, which means that as a participant, you have equal chance of either being placed in the treatment group or in the control group. Because obviously, if you don't have that random chance of being placed in one or the other, if you're asked, for instance, which group you'd like to be in, then it may be that you were highly motivated in the first place, and therefore you're going to skew all of the results. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
Very tricky, and definitely something I've got to kind of work some explanation into the methodology of how I set the research up. But that, it's in the background, that's coming as I write my research up. But yeah, I have totally experienced the challenges around that.
It's really hard. So yeah, this evidence is on a continuum.
Yes.
It's all evidence. So depending on where it is on that continuum will impact on how much credence we give it, how much we take notice of it, how we might use it, how we might talk about it. So going back to where I started, I think being evidence-based as a practitioner is really, really important, but we need to be aware that there's varying levels of evidence.
Yeah. So we're almost saying, if I've understood it, that we almost need to be doing that critical analysis before we even start reading the paper to decide where the paper's come from, how big the sample was, those kind of things.
Absolutely. I've done a PhD. I've been research focused, but I wouldn't want to discount the evidence that is presented to me by a coachee that I'm working with, where we've tried something and it's worked really well for them. For me, that's evidence that works. If they're telling me that was very useful to them, that's evidence. But what I wouldn't do with that then is go off and just apply it to everybody and say, well, it worked for Jane, and therefore clearly it's going to work for everybody else as well. So it's about how we view that evidence. But research papers are a really good place for coaches to go to, because we can be fairly sure that the research is robust, that it's been peer reviewed. So peer reviewed being other academic colleagues have read it and given feedback on it, and it may have been tweaked or changed based on their feedback. So we know it's been through a process. I'm not saying all published research is good research, because it's not, but it has been through a process. And so I think it's a good place for coaches to start to dip into the research. Now, it may be that starts with some good textbooks that are referencing research, because what the authors have done is read the research papers themselves and simplified it in hopefully in a way, and contextualize it to coaching in a way that we can all understand. I think the challenge with reading research papers is they can be quite jargony, and often people get caught up in the sort of data analysis and results section and struggle to make sense of that. So I often say, read the introduction, read the conclusion. Don't get too hung up on the middle bit.
Yeah, that's pretty good advice, actually, and saves quite a lot of time, because if you try and read every single piece of information in a research paper, you could be there. And if you like, I like to print it as well, and that's a lot of printing. If you print the whole thing. You said something there that was, I think I was going to say, how would you recommend someone does read the papers? But I think the other thing is when you were talking about the textbooks, and I think it is someone else has done that review, and you'll see a statement in a textbook, and then there'll be brackets and like 3 or 4 names. And if I'm right in thinking, that's because the person writing the textbook has done the review and found that 3 other people in their research found the same thing, which, coming back to your point about credibility, means that, okay, well, that's fairly solid then, because 3 or 4 people have found that, not just one piece, and there'll be different context and setting to that. So after textbooks, where would you recommend people look for research to consume?
This is the tricky bit. If you're part of a university, if you're a student or, involved in a university in some way, then you'll have access to university libraries where they often have full text papers, research papers that you can find and read. Now, back in the day when I started out, that was the only place, and we had paper copies of the journals on the library shelves, and you could only access them by going into a university library. But nowadays, things have changed, and there's a move towards what academics called open access, or what journals call open access. And what that means is there's a shift towards research not being just open and available to academics or students in the university. So from a practical perspective, what that means is you can find quite a lot on the internet. So Google Scholar is a great place to start to search for this sort of stuff, but just go to your internet browser and type in research on whatever it is that you're interested in. Sometimes what you'll find is titles of papers that you're really interested in, but there's no way to get access to them unless you pay. Don't pay, because there will be a way to access it. Someone in your network might be able to access it for you. There are extensions on that you can put on things like Chrome. So there's one called, I think it's called Open Access or something like that you can put onto Chrome. And so when you come across research, it will automatically, that you're interested in, it will automatically scan the internet and tell you whether there's a full text version of that available somewhere. There may occasionally be things that you just can't get hold of, and that's unfortunate. But yeah, Google or other search engines are also available. Is a great place to start, but expect to hit some walls along the way and maybe have to work quite hard to get access to some things. And ResearchGate is a good place as well. So there's a website called ResearchGate where authors have a sort of their academic profiles and will often share their research papers. And that's the important thing to say actually as well. If you find the title of a paper, don't be afraid if you can find the author's contact details to drop them an email and say, I'm really interested in this paper that you wrote. I've really tried hard to get hold of it. I can't get hold of it. I'm not at a university. Is there any chance that you can send me a copy? Now, my experience of doing that is that you will get some that are more than helpful. I remember one person that I emailed sent me about 20 papers that she'd written as a result of me asking for one, and others won't reply. That's unfortunate. But yeah, don't be afraid to ask. Sometimes they can't send it because if they have published it in a particular journal, then that journal may have put an embargo on it, which means that it can't be shared anywhere other than in that journal for a year or something like that. But yeah, always just see if you can get it from them.
Yeah, I totally echo ResearchGate. That's a great source, and I've found access. And sometimes you can access it straight away, and sometimes it says request the full text. And always, I think people have just written back and given me the text. And equally, I've emailed people directly, and similar experience, really want to share more. And the other thing that I've done is when I found papers that I've been really interested in, and I've seen that they've written other papers in the past, I've asked them what they're currently working on to see what's upcoming. Because if you like the work they've already done, chances are they might be doing more, and that might be interesting. And coming back to your original point about start by working with someone that's already trodden that path. And I do find people in the coaching community want to share and want to learn and grow. This, aside from the research itself, just the whole process of doing it, you learn so much as well. So thank you so much for sharing with that as well. You said something a while back about just because it's been published doesn't necessarily mean, sort of felt a bit of skepticism there. I wonder if you wanted to say more about that.
I had an interesting experience, I think, as an academic. There was pressure to publish, let's put it that way. There was pressure to get things published when I was completing my PhD. And I sort of have the sense sometimes, and this isn't true of all academics for sure, but I get the sense sometimes, there's two things really. I get the sense sometimes that there's a quantity over quality thing going on. And it comes from the pressure of the universities on academics to publish, because that can generate income. So if an academic is well published, then they can attract funding for their research. So it brings income into the university. So sometimes there is a quantity over quality thing going on, which means that what you might find is that the same piece of research is published about 3 or 4 times with a very slight little slant on it. That might be useful. It might give a different edge or attract a different audience. So there's that. But also, I think I've definitely read some research that I think is of dubious quality. Can I say that? That has limitation. That has limitation. And, that's not always a bad thing. I mean, as an academic, it's great because you can give that to students and say, read this, let's see what we think of this. And so I think the take-home message from this is that not all research is the same in terms of the quality. So there are times when research is not as robust as it could be. No research is perfect. That's a really important thing for us to remember. No research study is perfect. And when I started my journey in research with my PhD, it took me ages, because I have those perfectionist tendencies. It took me ages to be comfortable with that. There are always going to be limitations to the research that you do and to the research that you read. Always. It can't be perfect, because you can't address everything. And so that criticality that we talked about, being a critical consumer of research. And if the research is good, then they will flag up themselves what the limitations are. They will say, this was great because it told us A, B, and C. However, what it was unable to address, or what we need to be tentative around, are X, Y, and Z. So it will point out those limitations. If I were to give a take-home message, it's just that just because it's written in a research paper or in a book doesn't mean that you shouldn't be a critical thinker around it. Just because it's written down doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah. And this is coming, if I've understood, from what I've learned about you, from a place of someone who's had to work through all the material that there is around coaching psychology in order to build the competencies for the chartership for the British Psychological Society's coaching psychologist pathway. So that's making me think about, I'm imagining there would have been some highlights during that period and also probably some challenges. So I wonder what you've got to share on those.
In terms of the work that I did with the BPS, easier.
Thank you. Just watch me stumble.
Yeah. So in terms of the work that I did with BPS, it actually didn't involve too much going through the research. It was more a sort of practical, logistical exercise, although I was contracted to write the standards for coaching psychology. And within that, one of the standards is very much about being a psychologically informed coach. So what is your understanding of psychology and how do you bring that into your coaching? And I guess my knowledge and expertise around that came from the fact that I taught on a master's in coaching psychology. And so sort of had that background. And I was a chartered sport and exercise psychologist as well. So I have that sort of broad-based understanding of the core areas of psychology and sort of broadly what's out there. But I think in terms of research, the most challenging, I don't even know if it was the biggest challenge, but we have a standard around research. If people want to become a BPS chartered coaching psychologist, there is a standard that we have which talks about research. And we flip-flopped around that for quite a while, trying to make that decision about whether people should be consumers of research, so evidence-based practitioners, or whether we wanted to insist that they could demonstrate that they could do research. So that's right where we started, right, in this conversation today. And we flip-flopped around that for quite a long time. And I still think about it quite a lot, I think, because ultimately coaches are practitioners. And if you're going to be a coaching psychologist or a psychologically informed coach, then of course you need to be informed by the evidence base in psychology. And you have to be able to demonstrate how that knowledge and understanding is underpinning your coaching. But we ended up going down the route of you need to demonstrate that you can do research. So you need to do some research and give it to us to look at and make sure that it's robust research. And the reason for that really is because the decision was made that the best way to demonstrate you understand research is to do the research. So if you can come up with a good research question, situate it within the literature that's out there at the moment, come up with a study design that will answer your research question, collect robust data, analyze those data, interpret those data in the context of the original literature that you reviewed. If you can do all of those things, if you can demonstrate that you can do that, then that demonstrates that you understand research. It doesn't mean that you're an evidence-based practitioner, because you might have done that and then put it to one side and never looked at research again. So yeah, that was a really difficult one for us in terms of that decision. I guess I worry sometimes that it closes off the route to some people who either feel that they don't have the opportunity to do research or don't want to do research, but are heavily embedded in the evidence base and use that to support their practice.
Yeah, I can really feel that dilemma from conversations that I've had with a couple of people recently that I know were working towards their BPS chartership. I hadn't appreciated that was part of it. So, but now I understand where they were feeling the pressure from. And it can be the case sometimes that once you get something like that over the line, you sit back, oh, right, thank goodness that's out of the way. And to your point, do they then do some more? If it was as easy as demonstrating that we can consume the research, then where's the bar to show? So
yeah, it was a tricky one. And, for anyone that is listening that is interested in the BPS route and has done some research within their MSc or otherwise, you don't have to do a new piece of research for the purposes of this process with the BPS. If you have a piece of research that you could present and say, here's my MSc work, and it's at a good enough level and it's within the broad area of coaching psychology or could be related to coaching psychology. So for instance, even though I was already a chartered psychologist in sport and exercise, I had to go through a process to be dual recognized as a coaching psychologist. And as part of that, I had to demonstrate research. And so I used my PhD research as my demonstration of being able to do research. Now, the wording says it needs to be in coaching psychology or a closely related area. My PhD was in sports psychology, but I was able to demonstrate how the topic of my PhD actually has informed my coaching, and how if you were to read my PhD, which you probably don't want to do, but if you were to read my PhD, I think as a coach, you could probably take quite a lot from it. I think it's a topic area that is really important for coaches to understand and know about.
Yeah. So firstly, thank you for clarifying that, because whilst I want to be bringing real life stories and challenges, I don't want to be putting people off this. The idea is to encourage people to do it. But then the other part about sports psychology is this happens frequently when someone says, what do you do? And you say you're a coach. Instantly they say, oh, what, a sports coach? So you'd hope that there is a lot of linkage, and so much of sport is around the mental, and I know coaching is more than mental, it's the body as well, but so is sport. So I totally agree.
I say quite often that I honestly, and as I'm saying it now, I'm thinking about it again. I don't think there's anything that I learn in sports psychology that I either haven't applied in my coaching at some point or would be relevant if it were to come up in conversation. I think the crossover is huge. I think it's probably where it started. We think about Timothy Galway in the Inner Game book. He talks about performance being equal to potential minus interferences. So we can look at people's potential, and then there's all these things that are getting in the way. And he was talking about that in the context of tennis. So there's huge crossovers, and I think there's so much we could learn from sports psychology. And I still dip into the sports psychology literature. And actually, I think that's really important to say. I think we were talking about evidence, and I think as coaches, so this might be controversial, I don't know. I'd love to know what people think about this.
I love a bit of controversy, Marie. Please go ahead.
I say this often, and I'm waiting for somebody to push back on this. But I think if, as psychologically informed coaches or coaching psychologists, if we want to put it that way, I think we're generalists in terms of our psychological knowledge. I think we have to know, or we need to understand the human condition. We need to understand what it is to be human and what people are struggling with, whether it be in their relationships, their careers, their leadership roles, their everyday lives, their passions, whatever it might be. And so I think we're generalists. And so I think having a broad understanding of lots of different areas of psychology and just understanding what goes on for people is really useful. But I also think, and I wonder if this is the controversial piece, I also wonder when we're thinking about evidence and continuum of evidence, if it doesn't even really matter if that research is right or not, because we're coaches. So we're not going in and saying, oh, this is my diagnosis of your problem and here's an intervention to help you. What we're doing, the way I use psychology in my work, is that I tend to muse a lot. So somebody might say something to me. In my head, I'm thinking, I'm wondering if it's this thing here that's going on for them from my knowledge of psychology. And then instead of going, well, I think it's this, here's a bit of psychoeducation, I will say, I wonder, and I might frame the question in a way that, any other coach might frame it, but it's coming from a place of just wondering. So it's like, I always talk about it in terms of hold it lightly, explore it curiously. So I might have a particular psychological theory or framework in my mind because of what they've said, but I'm not wedded to that. And it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. Well, it matters if it's right or if it applies to them or not, but it doesn't matter if, from an evidence-based perspective, if it's right or wrong. The whole purpose of exploring that with them is to see whether they gain new awareness and insight into themselves from the questions that I ask, and then whether that helps them to move forward. So, as I say, no research is perfect, right? So if we're talking about self-confidence, I might pull on a theory I know of self-confidence and ask some questions about some things within that theory. And they might immediately go, no, none of that resonates with me. Okay, that's fine. That come from a different angle. But if they say, that's it, oh my goodness, that's what's happening for me, great. Then it's been useful.
Yeah, I really just want to say that again. Hold it lightly, explore it curiously, because that's something really easy to hold in one's mind when an intuition pops up because of something that you're aware of that they may not be. And I position it like leaves on a stream. So you're both sitting together by the stream and you have this intuition, and I place the intuition on the stream and let them take a look at it and decide whether they want to grab the leaf and look at it more or just let it just drift away. And the drifting away is, no, I don't want that one. But that tells you them something else, because if it's not that, then it helps them explore, okay, well, I can rule that thing out. And now we can look at some other things. So I think it's a great point to make. And thank you.
That's a lovely metaphor analogy. I love that. But I think the other thing, to just adding to what you've said, is that we might rule it out for now. Because we think about, I don't know if people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs that says there are some foundational needs that need to be met first before we can sort of build up and reach self-actualization. So forget about what's written in that model. If you think about that sort of pyramid structure, although some now say Maslow never intended it to be a pyramid, but whatever. See, that's what I mean. It doesn't matter.
Exactly. We've been curious about it, and now,
it doesn't matter. But basically what he's saying is for individuals, it doesn't matter what those needs are. There will be some foundational needs that we need to be met before we can move on to something else. And so your leaves on a stream, that leaf might be relevant, but it's not relevant right now because there's another leaf that's more relevant. And we need to do that bit first, or they need to do that bit first before they can reach for that other leaf.
Yeah, that is making me think about research papers as leaves. How do we choose which one to pick up? Because as consumers of research, we will all be interested in different things based on what we're interested in for ourselves, but maybe what we're interested in for our clients as well. So you and I might go scan ResearchGate and both of us pick something completely different because of where we are in life, where we are with our clients. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Sheela, because, when I was talking about reading research, when I was an undergraduate student, the course I was on was really well structured in terms of reading research is a skill. And it was really well structured in terms of, in our first year, they gave us some research papers and said, these are the ones you need to read, because they'd vetted them. They knew that it was relevant to the topic. They knew that they were simple and easy to understand. In the second year, they might have given us a couple and said, read these, but go and find some other. And by the third year, they were saying, find your own. Now, being faced with that find your own is huge. I remember when I started my PhD and I was put in an office and I was like, okay, what do I do? And my supervisor was like, well, start reading. And even though I had a very specific topic area that I knew I was going to be researching, faced with all of the information that was out there, I did not know where to start. It was overwhelming, daunting. I just didn't know where to start. And so for us as coaches, it's not enough to just say, oh, go and read the research. And I hear this a lot again in my supervision. I think it's why people turn to academic qualifications as their way of understanding research, because what I did as a program leader on an MSc and as a module leader was I packaged it up for them. It's like we were talking about earlier with textbooks, right? So I did that work, I did that scanning, and I selected what would be useful and I curated that content for them. And I think that's sometimes what we crave, is somebody else to curate it and package it up and say, read this, and then let's talk about it. And so people often spend a lot of money. I mean, I know people that have 3 MSCs, I've taught some supervisees and I'm saying to them, stop already. Stop doing MSCs. And it's because that's the way we've been socialized. We don't know how else to consume academic work other than go and do another degree. And that's, again, going back to the community piece. That's why I'm so interested in bringing coaches who are interested in psychology together in a space where we can curate that material, simplify it, help people to engage with it and understand it.
Yeah, please say a bit more about that, because you're in the middle of setting something up, aren't you? And I'm sure that people will be interested to hear about that.
I am, yeah. So again, it came from a place of people being interested in doing research. And initially I was thinking about setting up some sort of research hub that was really just a community of practice that brought people together and allowed them to support each other and collaborate and find other like-minded people. And I housed some focus groups, and people were saying, apart from the practical stuff, which we can't solve very easily around, thousands of pounds on software, it was about having a mentor, having peer support. It was about sharing their ideas with others and give them some feedback. It was about that community piece. So the idea started there, and it's expanded into a sort of bigger coaching psychology community of practice. So I'm in the middle of sort of putting it together at the moment. I've had about 200 people register their interest. So I know that people are interested, and I know from talking to people that they're interested. So it's wider, it's broader than just coaches who want to do research. It's any coaches who are interested in psychology and how psychology underpins and informs their practice as coaches. So it's called the Coaching Psychology Network. It's not quite up and running yet, but it will be very shortly. And as I say, it's a community of practice where people can come together. There'll be webinars every week. There'll be networking events. There'll be a sort of book/paper club where we can choose a research paper or read it and come together to discuss and critique and think about what it means for our practice. And that's the important thing. All of this stuff is about how can we become better coaches. Everything that we do within this community will have a focus on implications for practice.
Yeah, really cultivate our practice. And I will be adding my name to your list to make it 201. And I'm sure it'll grow. I'll make sure that we include how to get in touch with you for that and any other purposes before we close. But before we do that, what haven't we said that you feel needs saying today?
I'd love to tell you just a little bit more about the research that I did for my PhD was in something called attribution theory. And I just wondered if, in terms of sort of bringing this to life a bit more in terms of how research can inform our practice as coaches, I wonder if it would be worth just giving you a little sort of summary of that, because it's something that's not written about a lot and it's not been written about in the context of coaching. But I think it just brings this idea of research to practice.
Yeah, I think it would be really helpful. And there is a question on my list, which is, what have you implemented, either from something that you've read or from your own research, so that we can bring to life, how does this actually move from you getting curious about something, doing the research, and then actually putting it into your practice? So I'd love for you to share more. And I think people will be interested to hear that.
I can give a couple of examples, one from my research, and then there's another one that I talk about quite a lot and use quite a lot in my own work. So as I said, my PhD was in something called attribution theory. And all attribution theory is the way that we as human beings explain our successes and failures. Now, I don't particularly like the word failures, but I'm going to continue to use it because it's in the literature. It's just the easiest way to talk about it. So I did it in the context of sport, but it is prevalent across all areas of our lives. And I'm sure we can all think about times where we've either been successful in doing something, whatever that thing might be. And again, I'm going to be tempted to talk about work situations, but it could be in anything that you choose to do in your life. So we've either been successful or we haven't, and we try and understand it. We, as human beings, and this is what coaches need to understand, I think, as human beings, we are naturally predisposed to wanting to understand and wanting some control. And so understanding brings us that control. And so we naturally engage with that thinking after an event where we've been successful or not. Why did that happen? So if you think about an interview, why didn't I get that job? How did that go? What went well? What didn't go well? Why was I successful? Why was I not? So I think we can all agree that we naturally engage in that sort of thinking. It's more prevalent when we either fail or when the result, whatever it was really surprising to us. We're likely to engage with it more then. Now, what's really important about this, it's not the reason itself. So, for instance, let's think about exams. So you might say, I didn't do well in that exam and I was unlucky because none of the questions that I revised for were on the paper. So it's not the reason itself that impacts us later on. It's whether that reason is something to do with us, something controllable and internal to us, whether it's likely to be there next time or not. So if I do poorly on an exam and I put it down to luck, or it's just that the questions I revised for weren't there, then I have nothing to work on for the future because it wasn't anything to do with me. I did my revision. I was just unlucky. And next time, maybe the questions that I know will come up. So there's nothing I can do. However, if I put that down to, well, my revision wasn't thorough enough, so I strategically chose to focus on certain questions and not do the others. Now, this is something about me. It was my decision. It was my strategy. I chose to do that. And that can change next time. Now I have something to work on. So attribution theory is all about the reasons that we give for successful failure and how they impact us in the future. And they impact us in terms of our motivation, in terms of our emotions, and in terms of our effort or behavior going forward. So if you have a coach that's talking, so as coaches, I think we should all be aware of this because we can tap into it. So if we are talking to a coachee and they are telling you about something they went well or didn't, and they're making attributions that are perhaps going to have a negative impact on their motivation and behavior going forwards, then what we have to do is address that attribution, is to be curious about, that's interesting that you say that you were just unlucky in this situation. Was there anything else that could have contributed to this? Because otherwise, then, if they don't change that attribution that they've assigned to that, there's no way forward.
And so I'm trying to get my head into this. We're saying whether it's success or we'll use your word fail, even though neither of us like it. I think we're assured on that. Whether the outcome, to what extent they feel they may have any control over it. So what attribution they're making to that. And coming back to one of the key things in coaching, isn't it? And actually, interestingly, in well-being is where we have a sense of control, where we feel like we can make choices. That's always much better for us. And coaching is client-led. And so I think what we're saying here is where someone might be making an attribution to something that is maybe outside of their control, inviting them to think about where they do actually have control and how they might attribute that within themselves. Have I understood that?
Yeah. And it is quite complex. This is the trouble, right? It is quite complex because it can look slightly different for success than it can for failure.
Makes sense.
So we want and it's really important for us to say as well that when people are attributing failure to something external, uncontrollable, there's a self-esteem piece going on there. So they're doing it to protect themselves. Wasn't my fault. I can't feel bad about myself. And so we need to tread carefully, because if we're saying, well, look in this mirror, was your fault, then that might be too damaging for them in that moment. So we have to be tentative, and we wouldn't do that anyway as coaches, I know. But we need to explore it gently because there may be a self-protection thing going on. But put that to one side. So in terms of wanting somebody to feel motivated and empowered and in control and to go and try it again, then we need them to be attributing failure to something that is internal, controllable, and unstable, so unlikely to be the same next time. Success, we also want them to attribute that internally. So that was me. I know I was in control of that, and it's likely to be the same next time. So, example, when I did my PhD, I came out of my Viva, which is like an oral examination that you have, and you hear all these horror stories about how they last for hours and hours and hours, and people end up crying and rocking in a corner. And, mine was an hour and a half. And they started off by saying, we're happy with this piece of work. Let's just have a bit of a discussion. And none of the questions felt challenging. And I came out and said to my supervisor, I think they gave me a really easy time in there. And he just rolled his eyes, so that's me attributing success to external uncontrollable factors. It wasn't. And he said to me, have you ever thought that maybe you just knew your stuff? And I was like, genuinely, that did not cross my mind. And so if you think about that, where does that leave me? If I've had a hugely successful experience and I'm not taking credit for that, I'm saying, well, given that again, I might not have passed. That doesn't give me any sort of feelings of confidence or pride or motivation or those emotions and that motivation to go again, because next time it might be different. But if I attribute that to this was me, I worked hard, I knew my stuff, I prepared well, whole different ballgame.
Thank you for clarifying that, particularly around the, going gently around the fail or learn from mistakes situation, because I think that is really important. It was making me think about something that happened to me recently, which was my car broke down on my way to run a workshop. And in the moment, I just realized I wasn't actually stressed. And I was like, this is really fortunate that I'm able to sort this out really quickly and I feel okay about it. And when I analysed it, I realised, no, it wasn't just luck. I'd left myself double the time that I actually needed. I bought car breakdown cover. As soon as I heard the warning signs, I pulled over to check it out. And all those things contributed to me actually still arriving 20 minutes before the session started. So it wasn't a fluke. It was all the stuff that I'd done beforehand, hoping that it would never happen. But then when it does happen, it was so easy to handle because of those things. And so if I hadn't done that reflection, and for me, that's really important because I'm not very good at allowing myself extra time for things. So that was a time when, no, that's really paid off now. And so, yeah, going inside to look at those things is really powerful. So hopefully that example seems to fit your attribution theory.
And it's just something for us to just be aware of. And it's certainly something, when this community gets up and running, I definitely want to run a webinar on this because I think when I talk about it, coaches are really interested in it. It's just something we need to tap into and just be aware of, I think, in terms of noticing how what the reasons that people are giving and what, even if you don't have a thorough understanding of attribution theory, you can sort of think it through and think, well, if they're saying I'm just no good at maths, then where's the motivation for them ever to try? Surely we need to work on reframing that cognitive process that tells them they're no good at maths and challenging that. And just quickly, the other one I was going to talk about is there's another theory, and again, I don't want to get too technical for people that don't have a background in psychology, but there's another theory called self-determination theory, which is quite, again, big and complex. But basically what it says is that for people to be self-determined, for them to take control and autonomy and live their best lives, then there's three things that need to be present for them. And they are that feeling of control or autonomy or control, competence, so feeling like they can do the thing that they're being asked to do or want to do, so feeling that they have it within them to do it, and relatedness, which is often talked about in terms of relationships with others, but can also be thought about it in terms of relationship to the thing, to the work, let's say in a work context. And so feeling that this is aligning with their values, that this is meaningful to them. And so when I have conversations quite frequently with people around, for instance, I'm really struggling with my job, I get that Sunday evening dread, I don't want to go, I'm not enjoying it, I'm feeling weighed down by it all, I don't know what to do, I immediately am thinking, holding it lightly, about self-determination theory, I might ask some questions around, tell me a little bit about what you do. How much say do you have in what you do? What do you think about the work you do? How do you get on with the people around you? Are you being resourced effectively to do the work? And they're all questions, they're all standard sort of coaching questions that we might be asking to help somebody to gain new insight and awareness into their situation. But they're all related to those three things of, do you have some say and some control and that sense of autonomy in the work that you're doing? Do you care about it? And do you have everything you need, whether it be training or the resources, the time sometimes to do it? So do you have relatedness, competence and autonomy over your work? And more often than not, through asking, I don't even mention the theory, they don't need to know. I'll just ask general questions. And more often than not, somewhere in that conversation, somebody will say, that's it, I'm being micromanaged, or that's it, I've been asking for ages to have proper time to do this, or that's it, I need this training, or I don't care about the work. And there's that revelation for them. So again, it's the way that we're using what we understand, what we think we know about psychological theory. Doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It matters whether it resonates with them. but it gives us as coaches, our questions are always coming from somewhere. So why not have them come from a place, this framework that we're holding in our minds that we know something about, where we can build our questions around.
So we're saying we can use a theory like self-determination theory, ask our questions around control, competence and relatedness without even going into theory, because it will bring their self-awareness. Amazing.
It's a framework for conversation, just a framework for conversation.
I feel like we could go on for as long as we've already been talking, and probably more, but I should probably call it to a close. If people want to carry on this conversation with you, where's the best place for them to find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I don't know if it's worth me sharing a link to my coaching psychology network.
Yes.
Community of practice.
Yeah, please do. We'll get that in the notes. Great. Thank you so much, Marie. Really, really appreciate your time today. And I look forward to seeing more of you and your work as time goes on as well. So thanks again.
Thanks, Sheila. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and to make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub, enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.